Hello everyone, it is Joe here from OmniPoke, the channel that brings you guys everything Pokemon. If you're looking for PTCG live codes, make sure you check out the Potown store. You can get a 5% discount on your orders using that code OmniPoke. For today's video, we have the Baltimore Regional Championships, which has just concluded the first tournament of the new season. This is of course in the Brilliant Stars to Shrouded Fable format, the same as the World Championships, and it is the only tournament in this format, so we're actually closing the chapter on this expansion, even though we've only had 2 events in it. They've been pretty significant events. Of course, the World Championships as well as a 2,000 plus player tournament. We're going to be going through the top 8 decks as well as some other interesting ones in the standings, but first we're going to look at the overall Day 1 and 2 breakdown. We're here on PTCG Legends, which has a really great representation of this. As you can see, Regidrago remained the most popular archetype, but actually pretty close to it is both Raging Bolt and Charizard EX. Then we actually have a pretty significant dip, but still very popular and really rising up the ranks compared to the World Championships. Ancient Box is the 4th most played deck at the tournament. This is kind of the play that people touted a few weeks before, in that it was punishing the Raging Bolt archetype as well as the Roaring Moon and Miraidon, and as you can see, they were both still quite popular, with Lugia in there as well. A substantial drop-off in popularity of Gardevoir EX in the Day 1 field. There is a handful of Snorlax, Chien-Pao, and Iron Thorns as well. Notably, the world's winning deck wasn't all that popular. I think people accepted this was a metagame call, and the metagame might have shifted that a little bit more, or just the fact that Iron Thorns was known, and people would be teching their decks a little bit to respect the archetype makes it inherently a slightly more difficult call. We have a really interesting Day 1 to 2 conversion where Snorlax was absolutely insane. As you can see, had such a phenomenal conversion rate, way out ahead of these other archetypes. Now bear in mind, Snorlax was far less popular than some of the other decks towards the sort of top end, so it's mostly going to be people who already know about Snorlax and are well versed into how to play the archetype, but it might also indicate that there aren't enough of archetypes trying to respect Snorlax and hoping that like the amount of Lugia, the amount of Pecharunt in Ancient Box and Turbo Roaring Moon scared people off for Snorlax, and people didn't have their own tech cards in these other archetypes, which may have helped Snorlax push through into such strong records. Lugia notably also had a pretty decent tournament. It actually kind of flopped the NAIC when it was very hyped, and then Worlds when it was very hyped, but it seemed like with a little bit less hype around Lugia, it finally found a decent tournament and had really good Day 1 to 2 conversion. Gardevoir as well, again, an unpopular pick from the masses, but those who stuck with the deck are probably people who are experienced with it. We'll see Henry Chow, of course, he's like a monkey dory extraordinaire from the NAIC, right? So we know that people who are still sticking with Gardevoir had good reason to, and that's because they're well versed in the deck as well. And then the sort of big losers of the weekend, Miraidon really didn't do as well as its other turbo counterparts, and in fact Raging Bolt also had a pretty poor conversion, very popular out the gate, but didn't do all that well in the overall field. And for a slightly different representation of that Day 2, you can see that Regidrago and Lugia now are sort of the most popular ones. Then there's Ancient Box overtaking Charizard and the amount of them in Day 2. Snorlax having much more impact in terms of being a presence in this Day 2 of competition. Then we do have a couple of these turbo decks, followed up by Cornerstone, Ogerpon, Noivern. There was a contingent of players, we'll have a look at the list in a moment, who chose to bring this archetype, a really interesting one, an attacking, controlling deck, where really you're just trying to throw the stone wall out at people, the Ogerpon itself as well as Noivern, blocking the basic attacking decks, and saying that there aren't enough decks that can get around these annoying walling abilities and attacks, followed by a smuttering of other archetypes in there as well in 1s and 2s. So congrats to Henry Chow for winning the regional with Gardevoir EX. It's been his pet deck for a number of months now. It's certainly one of the strongest Gardevoir players in the room, and he's once again brought innovation. I remember looking back at the NAIC 60, it was vastly different to a number of other players who also made top 8, and once again Henry's completely adapted Gardevoir. What you thought it could do and what it was capable of has completely shifted, because we have once again reintroduced the rare candies into the deck, as well as a new A-Spec. Henry, of course, was sort of promoting Hyper Aroma as the crucial A-Spec over Unfair Stamp, which was kind of the mass pick. And once again, he's gone with a different one. It's Secret Box in this occasion. Gives you extra discard energy for early burst discard of Psych Energy, which I really think is the intention of this deck list, with the extra copy of the Earthen Vessel in here as well. You're trying to get as many energy into the hand as quickly as possible, then yeet them away with Secret Box, the Ultra Balls, and the 2 copies of Professor's Research, search, which is giving you more discard synergy, but also just a big dig into the deck to find these combo pieces, leaning way less into the Arven package. You just have the 2 copies, but also the secret box kind of counts, because if it's an opening hand, you can box for Arven and still get your way to a TM evolution. But clearly the intention of this list from Henry is to be a lot faster, try and candy onto, and actually pressurize decks. We actually saw that in the finals, where a turn 2 Gardevoir EX KO'd a Luminion and completely swung the prize race, because Gardevoir is quite tanky for some archetypes still. And there's also the 3 copies of the Bravery Charm in the list, which is trying to really push the aggressive damage output of Drifloon and Screamtail, still some of the best single prize Pokemon that we can be attacking with here, to try and skew that prize race. There aren't actually a huge number of jamming towers in Lugia anymore. There aren't that many lost vacuums in like Charizard right now. They can't really afford those spaces. Maybe there are some jamming towers going in and out of Regidrago. That's kind of something that some of the top echelon of Drago players pivoted towards. But ultimately, there wasn't a lot of respect to Gardevoir going into this tournament. Rightly so, it wasn't all that popular. But someone like Henry, with his deck list, was able to really capitalize on that and lean more heavily into really committing to high damage on the Screamtail and the Drifloon, knowing they're not going to be heavily punished. Surprising to me that Henry didn't choose to play Fluttermane or the Devo package for the Charizard matchup. That was still a certainly popular one in the room, but it seems like they were still able to navigate that matchup pretty effectively. Kieran Farrer made the finals, going back to his roots with Lugia. This was his archetype during the Silver Tempest era. Had a ton of great results, including the LAIC top 8 finish, and has had a hiatus with Chien-Pao for a while, but has finally made the way back to Lugia V-Star with a really impressive result. And I love the deck list here as well. Really like the 2-2 Chinchino line. I think that's the sweet spot where you still get that power spike, you still get to weave in the single prizer for the uptrade potential, but you're not clogging the deck so much that it's completely warping it. And we also see the shift towards the Mezagozas rather than the jamming towers right now. And then we have the Squawkabilly and Nespal. This is kind of yoinked from Rahul's list, which we'll see as well in a moment, from the World Championships, where it's an upgrade really on the Carmine engine, where you can just squawk things away if you have to, from Ultra Ball, from Aroma, from Nespal, but also just having the extra copies of Nespal is kind of better than having a 3rd copy of Minccino or a 4th copy of Lugia, because you can sort of mix and match when you see that in your opening hand. So it really does lean into, as he said in his own tweet, just trying to draw well with Lugia so that you can be representing the most powerful board situations from the acceleration of Primal Turbo. Playing 17 energy, having respect for the ball search cards, choosing Meza over Jamming Tower just for extra percentage plays. It's really just Lugia trying to be as consistent as possible, and that's always the thing that gets thrown at Lugia tournament after tournament. But we saw Kieran have a lot of decent hands, some good RNG on coin flips as well throughout the tournament, which is of course mandatory with Lugia, but take nothing away with how well he played this archetype. Definitely a master of Lugia. Emmett Hurley's been around the block for a few years, getting some impressive showings, but finally making that breakthrough into that top 8, and this time it was with a Turbo Roaring Moon variant, very similar to the World 60, but with a few tweaks in here as well. Having the 2 copies of Night Stretcher and just 3 copies of the Roaring Moon EX is a very small tweak, just to make your Pokestops that little bit more viable, and giving you some recovery of certain cards like Iron Bundle, for example, or things like Pheasantipity that can get targeted by the opponent. And quite interestingly, also having the Enhanced Hammer in the deck list, which is actually trying to respect that Lugia matchup, and it made for a really interesting top 4 match actually against Kieran, where the E-Hammer was trying to throw things in the mix to remove mist energy. This definitely works in the game 1 scenario blind, when your opponent doesn't know there's an E-Hammer there, and they only swing 1 mist onto their Lugia thinking it's completely fine. But now that this tech has been revealed, possibly Lugia players will adapt their strategy, have double mist energy onto their Lugia, V-Star, and other tankier Pokemon. So I think Emmett chose the right tournament to play this card and might have surprised a number of Lugia opponents, but this gimmick may not work in future tournaments. Beyond those small tweaks, keeping the really nice ratios for those Pokestops, I really love the Judge Disruption in here. It combines so nicely with the raw aggression of this archetype, and actually having the Petron EX was still very relevant because Snorlax had such a good day 1 to 2 conversion, and actually some other controlling archetypes like Pidgeot and even the Noivern attacking deck, these things were in the mix, so I'm pretty certain you'd be happy to have Petrant by your side in those later stages. Congrats to Stephen Farasco for getting that top 4 also with Lugia. It's actually a very similar 60 to Kieran's list. I think it's just incorporating the Pheasantipity EX over one of the energy cards. That's it. So feels like we're getting really close to a nailed list for Lugia these days. And just as I say that, Rahul throws the spanner in the works again, runs back the World 60. What a fantastic story from him to completely nail not only the World Championships, which is an insane achievement on its own, but also coming back with the same 60. Even when people were knocking some cards in the list, like not many people respected the Raikou Vessel Lightning package. I've actually started to weave this into the new format, and I actually am respecting it a lot more. So to see Rahul will prove people wrong again with this list. Very impressive stuff from him. Nolan Randall was the highest placing Ogerpon Noivern player, but you can see a number of the Canadians decided to bring it to really high placements here. And it's a very simple concept, hoping that there isn't enough answers to Cornerstone's Ogerpon if you play enough of them, or if there are going to be archetypes that can get around Cornerstone Ogerpon, they're going to be disrupted by the Covert Flight attack from Noivern. You can see there's a 3 penny in the deck list, there's the Scoop Up Cyclone. You're trying to just pick everything up and go lone Noivern and say that that's checkmate against a number of the basic attacking decks in the game. There's the Turbo Energize, you see this in the Iron Thorns deck and it's kind of been copy-pasted over so Ogerpon can get a chain of attacks going. There's the Mist Energy, so you can't get wrecked by damage counter placements. And of course, that's also going to be important for the Roaring Moon matchups. And then really it's just a high support account and Pokegear trying to stitch everything together so you can get the right ones for the right situation. So next up we have Rowan's list from top 8 with Reggie Drago this time. We've seen him make multiple regional top 8s at this point and better. A couple interesting choices going on in the 60. Iron Bundle, which I haven't seen for a while. It's something I had in my very, very early list of Reggie Drago and it has dropped off. So that's an interesting inclusion, especially when there's no Night Stretcher in the deck list. I thought that would kind of go hand in hand, give you an even bigger upside to have this sort of card. But turns out the Hyper Blower is just important enough on its own accord to be worthwhile. And there's also a change up for the Stadium card, the Collapse Stadium. Maybe comes down to not really respecting Lugia so much or not expecting it to be quite as popular as it was at the World Championships, or possibly looking to capitalize on mirror match situations and some other archetypes that like to set up damage against you. You can deny the opponent a win condition with that Collapse Stadium, removing the potential to snipe. Could be even mirror match situations where your opponent's lining up a Kieran play, or if there's Dragapults in their schemes. Rowan also bumping up the count of Iono to 3. This might also be nodding and respecting the amount of aggressive archetypes he was expecting this tournament, so really cute decisions overall. Ian Robb once again made top 8. Absolutely incredible story to see him back at the top tables again. The bounce back is real. A number of other top players also had very solid finishes at Baltimore with the exact same 60 here. Some interesting changes from Ian from the World 60 though. He has changed up the Night Stretcher for just a second copy of Super Rod, has included a Jamming Tower, and actually cut the Cancelling Clone from the 60 as well. Also incorporating the Cleffer. Again, maybe this is a nod to just there's going to be more Racing 2 prize archetypes, so having an extra single prize to throw into the active, obviously one you can easily retreat if the opponent isn't getting aggressive, is a nice thing. So changing with the meta is something that all the top players have to do, and Ian's been able to do so really nicely despite having an incredible finish in the very last tournament. Looking at some of the other top placing lists, then we have Grafton Roll. This guy's been around Pokemon for many years. I remember looking back at early EOICs, seeing him playing Greninja back in the day. And he's brought the Palkia V-Star Dustnoir archetype. A really, really spicy one going on here. We've got the Pokestop engine alongside Night Stretcher. This is something I absolutely adore from the Shrouded Fable expansion. You can use the trekking shoes, the Pokestops, as fodder to get you into your Night Stretcher and actually get your evolution search online. It's a really neat combo that we gained. We saw Henry Brand incorporate this in his Bennett Dustnoir package. Obviously with Bennett, you're trying to buy time and pick apart the opponent's board. And this deck does it in a very similar way, actually. You use the Dustnoir to open up avenues for your Radiant Greninja or your Greninja EX in the deck list. You can Star Portal to a Froakie before Rare Candying, of course, and it's trying to pave the way for you to take multiple knockouts, and crucially those knockouts will be dealing with multiple engine Pokemon at once or multiple attacking Pokemon at once. The opponent is left with nothing. Whereas in other matchups, Dustnoir could be used to amp up Palkia's damage to reach on certain V-Star Pokemon or EXs, or even make that Blood Moon Ursaluna an even more dangerous late game threat. Palkia Dustnoir has also been doing really well in Japan over the last couple of weeks in the new format as well. It's actually the premier list over a Noctowl Area 060, so Grafton definitely had his finger on the pulse, and I think we're actually going to see more of this archetype over the next coming weeks. Jeremy Gibson was the highest placing Pidgeot control archetype, very Snorlax heavy and also a high count of those Mimikyu. Also notably Liam Halliburton also having a high finish with a 60 as well. Once again, we're seeing the secret box come out to play, which is another really cool card to see. It does seem like more and more players are finding ways to build around this A-spec and work it into their 60 to be a real superstar. We have the typical walling threats, we have Luxray, we have the Sob option, we have the Ursaluna EX that can come in for high damage. You can see just how much space they're trying to steal when they're only playing one copy of the Pidgey and the Hisuian Heavy Ball and hoping that's going to be enough, so that you still lead out with your Snorlax and Mimikyu possibly that little bit more often, and knowing that you can easily thought in this Pidgey if it is KO'd, so you don't necessarily have to get multiple of them on the board early anyway, because you can still force out that Pidgeot EX later. George Illich was the highest placing Raging Bolt player. Nothing wild going on with the list. is having the couple Bravery Charms in the list, has the Pokemon Catchers, the Night Stretchers in here as well. A really solid baseline of Raging Bolt, which is going to be really important because this archetype is doing really well in Japan in the new formats, just including one copy of Briar. So taking this as a baseline and finding one slot is probably something you're going to want to do as an early baseline for this archetype. Andrew Kennett bought a real spicy Ancient Box archetype. It's actually trying to hybrid between Great Tusk Mill and Ancient Box itself. A number of matchups where you're going to try and go for the Vengeance Fletching, be a one prize archetype, certainly against those basic attacking archetypes, just going full out Roaring Moon is going to be the preference. But then having the flip side of Grand Collapse and Cornerstone Ogerpon, 2 copies of them mind you, as well as 2 Super Rod, for matchups like Charizard, where essentially you say you can't beat Charizard the usual way with Vengeance Fletching, so let's switch up our strategy and go for that annoying Cornerstone Ogerpon once again, and say your opponent doesn't have enough answers to this card. It was a really delicate balance from Andrew to get enough controlling pieces in the deck like Palpad, Eerie, Penny, whilst also having still plenty of ancient cards to overcome the basic attacking aggressive archetypes to make sure your Vengeance Fletching was dealing enough damage. Somewhere in the world, Henry Brand is fist pumping right now because Burnett Dustnoir did get a top 32 placement, piloted by Tyler Matthews. There's even a Salvatore in this deck alongside Luminion, so you can try and force that turn 1 Burnett attack, the Everlasting Darkness, so you're not forced into a coin flip from your Shuppet. Item Lock is actually really dangerous for a number of archetypes in the game right now. It buys so much time against a number of archetypes that your Dustnoir can pick apart a board pretty cleanly, especially when you're combining that Item Lock with the constant Ionos to low hand sizes once you've used a few Curse Blasts. We have a top 64 Clorf deck with the Binding Mochi ramping up the Unhinged Scissors damage output. Of course, Radiant Sneasler chipping in here as well. Clorf is actually really annoying for the basic attacking decks, so it's actually a similar approach to picking the Ancient Box for this weekend. There's also some pretty good synergy with Blood Moon Ursaluna with Binding Mochi as well. You'll also notice our old friend Hisuian Electrode V is in the deck list, and of course we no longer have the spicy Seasoned Curry to help push that damage outputs. As you can see, the Tantrum Blast is only going to deal 100, but wait, we have Binding Mochi and Cobalion, so just by poisoning this Electrode and having the combination of the Tool and Cobalion in play, you still can one-hit KO those Charizards. And that's actually a really creative solution to still having a means of one-hit KOing Charizard, one of the main weaknesses of a Clorf strategy. Another thing to note, of course, is that we didn't have access to the Petrump promo at the World Championships, so this is actually the first tournament that Clorf could shine, and I think it's fair to say that it really did. Cameron Kawasaki continues to bring the Goldengo archetype to great success, another top 64 placement, just like the World Championships. This time I think the change was incorporating a Klefki. I can't remember that being in the last 60. Still sticking with the Hyper Aroma though, still has those Pokemon Catchers and the Professor Churro scenarios, so a lot of those same counts from the World Championships, just a few tweaks here and there. There's also an Arc Armor Rouge that made top 64, incorporating the spicy Luminous and Legacy energy package, so you can have some tight coverage from Raikou, some 2-prize attacking play from Iron Hands as well as Delphox if the opponent isn't expecting some snipe pressure, and Luminous energy also works on Adrenabrain from Monkey Dory, so you can get some really cute math going on here, alongside your Magma Basin, constantly damaging your own fire dudes. That can certainly allow the Radiant Charizard to be a much more dangerous attacker, hitting that 280 threshold, and actually help push Ampy very much, for example against Ancient Box into one-hit KOs for 2 prize cards. There's actually a lot of potential going on here with so many different attacking threats. That added manipulation from Monkey Dory is actually going to find itself helpful in a number of situations, I would think. There's still a lot going on here. It's not the fastest archetype in the world. It doesn't have that much disruption. It's really just hoping that its attacking suite is so threatening that you can find ways to strong prize maps. But at the end of the day, you still have Starbirth trying to stitch everything together, and a really decent supporter engine as well to fall back on. Despite Charizard's popularity, the highest placement was actually in top 64. It has the 2 copies of Forest Hill Stone as well as the Entei V in here. We actually saw that incorporated from a number of the Brazilian players at the World Championships, and having that second copy of Forest means that, hey, you're just not going to prize that when you need it with your Arven. The Prime Catcher's also in here to really make use of that Entei when you're coming up against the Regidrago matchup, so you can use that Burning Rondo into some Ogerpon and initiate a prize race. And then we come to Todd's deck of cards. There's lots of them. They're all one-ofs. I guess it gives you a lot of options. There's a Radiant Jirachi in here. Yeah, you figure it out. You know. What do you want me to say?